From Noah Brenner. He's the executive editor of operations with Energy Intelligence. Noah, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Now, Shell has reported those record annual profits, hitting nearly 40 billion in 2022, double last year's total, as we just heard there as well, and highest in its 115-year history. It's an astonishing amount. We know that they are having to pay windfall taxes now in the UK and Europe, but given the current energy crisis and those figures, should they not be paying more?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very good question, but it's also we need to think about kind of where are the operations of most of these companies. I mean, Shell is obviously incorporated in the UK. It has operations in the EU, which has they call it a solidarity payment. It's essentially a windfall tax scheme in place, and the UK has a windfall tax. But I mean, many of Shell's profits are made outside of these jurisdictions, and so I think trying to understand how much impact that would have, it's not as simple as simply that those taxes would apply to all of these very, very significant earnings.
But Noah, it is often said, though, that windfall taxes will deter renewable investments. And however, critics have pointed out that Shell has been paying more to its shareholders than it spends on renewable investments. Do you think that the renewable card is being used as an excuse to avoid paying more tax?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's, kind of oil companies have said consistently that, look, if you take more money away from us in taxes, that's less money for us to invest, and that doesn't necessarily solve the energy shortages that are then driving those high prices. You're right to point out. I mean, Shell returned roughly $26 billion to its shareholders over the past year. Comparatively, it spent much less than that on its energy transition activities. But I mean, whether or not it's necessarily, if you're ramping up windfall taxes, whether or not that's necessarily going to, like I said, to solve this issue around higher prices. I mean, yes, you can subsidize energy usage, but I mean, essentially, what you really need is additional energy supply. And so, I think that is, while it's a valid argument to some extent, but also haven't seen Shell significantly cut back on any of these renewables or oil and gas expenditures specifically due to these windfall taxes. We haven't seen a large change in their investment approach.
And now you said, I'm just going to pick up there on what you said about it's about supply. This does come as energy companies, are still investing in more oil and gas projects. We've seen more North Sea licenses, projects being launched, energy companies getting involved with new projects in Guyana. And, so with regard to that, that we're kind of seeing this picture that the oil and gas companies are putting forward that, we need to improve supply, we need to replace oil and gas. But on the face of it, when we're seeing these new projects they're getting involved with, it doesn't really look like they're doing much to fight climate change. What do you say to that?
It's a very good argument, and I think what companies are saying is, look, we can only move as fast as society will move, and Shell has been kind of very vocal around this point of, look, if we don't see society reduce demand for oil and gas, and generally we haven't thus far, despite very lofty climate goals, without that continued investment in that supply, this leads to these price spikes. Now, at the same point, we have seen these companies diversify to some extent into renewables. Shell sells renewable power in the UK, in Europe, in the US, across this portfolio of investments. And we're seeing them invest in things like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, which are much kind of earlier stage enterprises. Now, Shell and many of the European majors in particular do have emissions goals. To reduce emissions through net zero by 2050. Now, there are real questions about how these companies get there. And we have seen steps to make these types of reductions. But, I guess I would say similar to the questions that we have around how, the world itself achieves the Paris goals of limiting global warming below, say, 1.5 degrees Celsius. there are also questions around how companies are able to make those changes fast enough in a way that isn't disruptive to the energy system and doesn't cause the types of economic hardships that we've seen at times over the past year, but still does it fast enough to achieve these climate goals that we know we need if we're going to limit the effects of climate change.
Okay, no, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but really interesting. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme.